as you can hear, the recording is in process. Same kind of ground rules for this morning. If you got a question, feel free to raise your hand. Just ask that you don't interrupt Ben while he's talking, but he's a wealth of knowledge. And then Ben, I'll let you introduce yourself, but this will be this afternoon class on weeds here in Southwest Colorado. The hope is that at some point, once the weeds start to come up and get going, maybe we could do a weed walk and we can time it with a kind of a plant walk if we wanted to walk all the way down to the library garden and kill two birds with one stone. So Ben, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Darren. My name is Ben Bain. I've been working with the weed office for about 13 years, and I'm the county weed manager. And yeah, we'll get deep into the weeds. So what are noxious weeds? Well, they're more than just plants out of place or less desirable plants. They're non-native plants to North America, and that's rule number one for how the state and the county defines noxious weeds. And they disrupt our native vegetation, ecosystems. Noxious weeds thrive because they don't have natural controls and they're able to adapt to varied climatic conditions. They flourish in areas that have been disturbed and lack native vegetation. Back in 2014, CSU did a case study on the estimated cost of noxious weeds on agriculture, wildlife, recreation, and they came to about $14 million. And that can be the cost of treating noxious weeds or the loss of yields with agriculture and just kind of the mitigation costs in general. So it's actually, it comes down to the money, and that's a big factor of it. The state of Colorado passed the Colorado Noxious Weed Act in the early 2000s, and it helped define a system of ranking different noxious weeds and how local governments can best manage those noxious weeds on a local level. And it also kind of laid the ground rules out for what's required for landowners and even public land agencies. They determined that noxious weeds have become a threat to natural resources of Colorado, as it results in thousands of acres of crops and rangelands and habitat for wildlife that are affected by noxious weeds every year. Organized and coordinated effort must be made to stop the spread of noxious weeds. The designation and classification of noxious weeds into categories for immediate eradication, containment, and suppression will further assist the state in coordinating efforts to stop the spread of noxious weeds. So that ranking system is a list A, B, and C kind of system that the state handed down to local government, and then local governments can kind of fine tune that. But ultimately, list A weeds are populations of noxious weeds that are not very common within the county, and therefore they're designated for eradication, and also includes noxious weeds that haven't made it here yet. So if we do find it, we want to get rid of it as soon as possible before it becomes a bigger issue. B-listed weeds are populations of noxious weeds that are pretty common within the county, but they are designated for required management. C-listed weeds are populations of noxious weeds that are fairly common. They're recommended for management, but not required. So this is kind of a background of what the county weed office actually does. A lot of people don't even know there is a weed office or anything about it. One of the best assets that we can provide taxpayers and landowners are custom weed management plans and property walks and site visits. So somebody can schedule a visit and then we'll go out to your property. We'll take a look at it, look for noxious weeds as well as helpful plants, native plants, stuff like that. And I work with the individual landowner to kind of create a custom weed management plan that kind of goes for their goals and kind of helps them fine tune what their overall vision is for their property. And it's no cost to the landowners. And so it's for property managers, subdivisions, even public land agencies. And so, yeah, typically that's just a property walkthrough. And we have our weed office right next to Darren's office. And so people can bring in plant samples for ID. It's probably best to call first, or you can just leave a sample at the front desk. Ideally, you want to bring in a more mature sample. If it's just like a 4-inch long plant with no flowers or anything, it's really hard for us to identify. I'm pretty good with the noxious weeds, but there's literally thousands of plants out there. You can also email the photos to my email as well. Our website, laplataweeds.org, is a really helpful resource. We got hundreds of articles and links to other websites and different areas for weed identification and more information in general. And then people can call in directly if they have questions about control methods or suggestions. We provide educational resources as well as lectures, public field trips, stuff like that. We also help people get certified to spray herbicides and get licensed. That can help out commercial applicators, but also private landowners who want to use restricted use pesticides. And we've been writing for and managing grants such as the cost share program, which is a grant funded project from the state of Colorado Department of Ag that can help offset the material cost of weed management for private landowners. So that's typically a rebate program where the landowner buys the materials first, they do the treatment, they follow the weed management plan that is required for that cost share grant. And then afterwards, you submit the paperwork and it will cover costs by 50% for herbicides, surfactants, and even seed mixes. We're actively working with various land managers, with the city, BLM, Forest Service, CDOT, state. And we're also acquiring and testing various biocontrol options throughout the county as well. And so that's typically in the form of bugs that are host specific, that work on just one type of plant. And then over time, hopefully it'll reduce the populations or make it more susceptible to disease or other climatic conditions. And so we've been kind of just testing out different bugs throughout the county for different weeds and stuff like that. We're also responsible for maintaining and treating noxious weeds for 700 miles of roads, and that translates to about 1,400 miles of roadsides. We have dozens of county properties to manage for weeds as well. We're actively working with the planning department by issuing weed management plans for new development in the hopes that if there's a small issue with noxious weeds before the development, it gives them a chance to identify the problem and maybe take care of it before they develop it, because typically after development, there's a lot more ground disturbance and the noxious weeds get worse afterwards. And then we do use a commercial applicator contractor for the work that is done with spraying herbicides. Also, enforcement is a big part of the Colorado Noxious Weed Act, and that was adopted into our county code. In the years past, we really haven't had the budget or the manpower to really go after this process too deeply. However, this year we do have some funding for it. However, it's going to be really hard to specifically go after certain properties versus others. So we have a ranking system based on list A populations that haven't really taken over yet, or populations that are near public lands or waterways, stuff like that. We have 30,000 parcels in La Plata County, and I'd say the majority of them do have noxious weeds. So we're not going to be able to go after everybody for any kind of weeds, but we are going to start looking at some properties that have some weeds where we hope we can treat and eliminate that risk in the future. But it's a very complicated process. This is a flow chart of what we have to go through for every single parcel that we send a weed notice for. So there's a lot of different steps to it, and it's something that you might be seeing on the horizon later this growing season. And then ultimately, weed management is not a one-time deal. Unfortunately, A lot of these seeds can be viable for 2 to 50 years. Usually takes 1 to 2 treatments each year for a consecutive 3 to 5 years to see a noticeable difference. So you got to really keep up with it. I've seen people go really hard for a couple of years and they kind of back off. And then after a couple of years after that, they're kind of back to where they started again. So it's really important to just keep up with it. And then afterwards, you kind of exhaust that seed bank and you start making some good ground. And then afterwards, it's really just spot treatments and just a lot more easy to manage. So we recommend using integrated weed management techniques. And so that's not just, spraying, that's not just mowing, it's looking at a variety of techniques and protocols to eliminate noxious weeds. Like an example of cultural management would be to not let your animals overgraze a specific area and to rotate grazing in general. Mechanical methods could be mowing, in some cases tilling, but we're not a big fan of that typically because we're in the Southwest. Biological treatments, usually in the form of bugs, but there's also a rust fungus that is being used for Canada thistle that I'll talk more about. And then herbicides. And herbicides are most effective for larger areas, and they're typically the results are quicker and just less time involved. And then also revegetation is really key. A lot of times people will eliminate their noxious weeds, but then they just have a blank dead spot where those weeds used to be. And it's basically just a welcome mat for noxious weeds to invade. And so having that healthy competition is really key. And then so for annuals and biennials, that these plants that just reproduce by seed, you just want to stop that seed cycle. You want to get them before they flower and they go to seed. Whereas some of these deeper rooted perennials, it's best to use a systemic herbicide either at bud stage or around fall when those plants are taking all of its nutrients from the top down. So what are some of the causes of noxious weeds in our area? And I'd say it pretty much comes down to these three. So we got drought, disturbance, and overgrazing. So we've been in a historical drought since 2001. That was the same year that we had the Missionary Ridge fire. And since then, we really haven't recovered. We've been in severe drought category for a number of years. Even if we get a decent year for snow or something like that, it's just not enough to keep us out of this kind of ongoing drought. And so things are getting drier and drier. The native plants that were already kind of stressed are having a really hard time establishing deeper roots. And so when it is dry and hot for months at a time, they just can't survive those kind of climatic conditions. Whereas a lot of these noxious weeds, they come from really extreme, harsh environments, and they can thrive even if it is really hot, dry, and droughty. And then also the lack of irrigation water and stuff like that can affect people's growing season. And ultimately, if you can't water your fields, your grasses are going to be less competitive. So development in plowing and tilling, stuff like that, it's a huge factor for most of these noxious weeds. So in the form of, housing developments or roadways or plowing for snow and even tilling and plowing a field. We typically don't recommend tilling and plowing because it degrades the soil quality. It exposes kind of that rich topsoil to the elements like wind and sun and stuff like that. And stuff like that works in Kansas, but we are just too dry for that. So typically we don't recommend something like that. And so when you do till a field, it's just basically a blank slate where the noxious weeds already kind of have a head start. And then unmanaged dryland grazing and overgrazing. And so historically for centuries, the West has been overgrazed year after year after year. And it's really changed the landscape of the West in general. And it's really decimated the native plants and the native grasses population, stuff like that. And so that's really affected pretty much all of our public lands, especially in desert landscapes, but even in the high country, grazing can really have dramatic negative effects on the native plant communities. But then just something localized, like having a corral with, you know, a bunch of horses and they just eat everything to the ground. And then typically the only thing that will come back are noxious weeds or even poisonous plants, because the horses just eat whatever they can. So it's kind of the same with cows and sheep and stuff like that in general. So these are the top 5 that we have in our area, and these are all list B species. And so first and foremost is musk thistle. It's by far the kind of the most noticeable weed that we have in the county, and it accounts for pretty much a good portion of what we map when we do our inventory. And that's another role of the county weed office, is we do GPS inventory of noxious weeds throughout the whole county in general, trying to get an idea of what problems are in specific areas. And with that data, we can kind of revisit those areas or try to target them with, you know, kind of well-placed and well-timed treatments and stuff like that. But ultimately, it's musk thistle, spotted knapweed. La Plata County has the most spotted knapweed out of any other county in Colorado. Canada thistle, that's one that's almost become naturalized, meaning that it's kind of everywhere on Forest Service land. It's in all sorts of riparian areas around ponds and even up in the high country, stuff like that. Russian knapweed's another deep-rooted perennial that's totally taken over certain parts of the county, like around Marvel and Breen. There's literally thousands of acres of this plant. It really takes over. And then oxeye daisy, it's a plant that really thrives in different climatic conditions, and it's really taken over the high country kind of north of Purgatory. So the key to, you know, looking at any kind of weed management is to first identify the plant successfully, and then to break it down into the different growth cycles. And so ultimately it breaks down to 3 different types. So there's annuals, only has 1 year to flower, go to seed, and then it's done for the year. It's done forever after that. Biennials, they come up as a rosette the first year. The second year, they bolt, go to flower, and then they're done. And then perennials, which typically have deeper root systems, and they come back year after year from that same root system. And those perennials can be the toughest ones to manage because the majority of the plant mass, up to 80%, is actually underground. So in general, with gardens and just plants around the city and stuff like that, they're typically annuals. And that's kind of good news in a way because they're relatively easy to manage, but they're also very common. But ultimately, you just want to stop that process of flower to seed, and then you just want to stop those seeds from hitting the ground. But the best thing to do is to identify that plant as early as possible before it even flowers. And so here's an example of some of the more common annuals that we have. And it just so happens to coincide that most of these are C-listed weeds. And so I think that's mainly because they're a little bit easier to treat, and they're maybe not as much of a detriment to livestock and stuff like that. So these are typically weeds that are recommended for management, but not necessarily required. But if you have a garden or something like that, it's best to manage them. So mustards are a real common annual that we have. They typically flower earlier in the year, so typically around May and June. And these mustards typically have like a yellow flower. They grow really quickly. Flicksweed is one, and you can identify it early by its leaf patterns. They're kind of more robust, kind of bigger, symmetrical leaflets, and then they bolt, and then this narrow seed pods are really distinctive of flicksweed, and it kind of has some issues with, you know, it kind of affects horses, but it can also just kind of take over a landscape within a year or two. And then yellow sweet clover is a non-native mustard. It's typically kind of tolerated because it's so common. It's actually a really good early season pollinator. And some people actually use it as a cover crop, but you're kind of playing with fire For a cover crop to work, you ideally want to grow it to the point where it's right about to flower and go to seed, and then you cut it down. And so in that process, you have a kind of a canopy of organic matter, kind of helps that soil moisture retention, and will return organic material to the soil. But you have to really keep up with it, and you can't let it go to seed. And I think Lauren had a question.
I do. I think I just heard you say that yellow sweet clover is a type of mustard. Is that accurate?
As far as I know, yeah.
Okay. I had somebody who was constantly correcting me when I would say, hey, look at that mustard. And they go, no, that's sweet clover. But so that's why I was asking.
Well, yeah, I just always assumed it was, so don't quote me on it.
Okay, we'll check it out. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's actually, it looks similar to alfalfa. It has that trifoliate leaf, and it does have kind of nutritional values. But if you do let it run unchecked, it can really take over. We see it all along roadsides, and it just comes in really dense monocultures, and it's just quick growing and stuff like that. Lamb's quarters is another annual that we see around, and you can kind of see those leaves in the beginning, kind of a lighter green color, and then it puts out these really tiny flowers that you can't really see, and then produces those seed pods. So ideally what you want to do is stop this plant from getting to that flower stage. And if you do identify it when it's already flowered and seeded out, you typically, you have to contain those seeds. So typically you got to bag them and dispose of those seeds, because even if you pull up the plant and it's still at that flower seed stage, there's enough nutrients in the plant where it'll continue that seed production, and then you're just ultimately trying to keep those seeds from reaching the ground. This is another common one, common mallow, also known as cheeseweed to some people. I don't mind it as much as some other weeds. It kind of acts as a decent ground cover, but if you can keep it from going to seed, that's kind of the best way of managing it. But it's everywhere. It's probably the most common weed within Durango as far as just backyards and stuff like that. But again, you're just trying to stop that seed production. Pigweed is another annual. It has these big, robust leaves and stems, and it puts out this kind of flower stalk, and it'll turn kind of orangish once it dries up. Typically that's more in rangeland type situations, but I've seen it become pretty dense in some areas around some hay fields and gardens and stuff like that. Prickly lettuce is another annual. It's pretty easy to define. If you just pull a leaf or a stem, you'll see some sap come out. Puts out these little tiny yellow flowers for like a day, and it poofs up and has these kind of little cotton flights for the seeds. Not that hard to deal with, but if you let it get out of control, it can be kind of messy, especially if you're trying to hand pull it. Your hands just get covered in this kind of sap that's kind of nasty. Kochia is one of the more robust annuals that are out there in the West. It can grow out of pretty much any kind of soil conditions, and it's really, really tough to get rid of. A lot of people don't notice these weeds until they become 2, 3, 4, or 5 feet tall. And then at that point, they're pretty much flowering, they're seeding. It's kind of too late to deal with them. And then a lot of people would actually treat the kochia with herbicide, either at the wrong rate or the wrong timing. And that plant will still continue to grow and to seed out, and then it's resistant to that herbicide in the future. So a lot of the more common herbicides will not kill kochia at this point. And I think we're going to start seeing that a lot more because with hot and dry weather, herbicides aren't as effective. And then if people aren't using them correctly and they're not killing the plant, they're just creating that resistance in the future. And so this one, it can kind of come up as like almost a carpet of plants sometimes when there's just the right summer for it. Some years are kind of worse for other weeds than others. And it's kind of soft to the touch. and kind of has the red stem, stuff like that. But ideally just getting it before it gets 1 to 2 feet tall. Otherwise, you're best off pulling it, containing those seeds, or, you know, if you can, if you have a lot of it, like in a field or something, it's probably best to hit with a systemic herbicide that is effective for this type of plant. Russian thistle, that's another one that's very predominant around the West, especially the arid Southwest. And in the beginning, it kind of comes up as an almost different plant. It's hard to recognize it as a tumbleweed, but in the beginning, it has these really distinctive kind of dark purple lines that go throughout the stems and the branches, and then the leaflets are kind of stringy. And it kind of seems innocent, not that big of a deal. But soon after, it'll get a lot more bigger and robust, and it'll start putting out those thorns. And then after those thorns are developed, it dries up, becomes that tumbleweed. It'll blow miles and miles away. And it's pretty much in every area that's been overgrazed throughout the West. It's really difficult to control once it's established. But the key is just to identify it when it's younger. Cheatgrass is another very common weed throughout the West. This one's different because it's a winter annual. So it starts in late summer or early fall, and it looks different than other grass. You know, some people get really excited when they see it because they see this nice tender grass growing, and then they think, oh, great. But typically the cheatgrass has a twist or a spiral shape to the leaf, and so that's different than a lot of the more common grasses out there. And then also you can take a look at areas that are already seeded out, and if you see a nice tender grass in those areas that had seeded out that spring, it's probably going to be cheatgrass. And then once it overwinters, it goes pretty much right to seed in April, May. And then it's done for the year, it drops its seed, and then kind of continues its life cycle, and it can become, you know, a fire danger, or it's just really hard to control in general. It is a grass, so the typical broadleaf herbicides that we recommend don't work on it. And so typically like a Roundup kind of thing, which is non-selective, can work on it. But then again, Roundup will kind of get rid of all the plants there, and so you end up with a blank space. So you got to be really careful that you want to revegetate it afterwards. And then are there some questions? Some people call different plants tumbleweed. So I've heard people call kochia tumbleweed. I've heard people call just different plants in general tumbleweed. So it's best to just call it Russian thistle.
I'm sorry, I think I mentioned there could be kochia, could be Russian thistle, it could be tumble mustard. We see those around here too, right?
Yeah.
All those things tend to roll once they dry down.
Yep. Yeah, but the Russian thistle is a lot more likely to detach from the ground, and then it's kind of this round, bulbous shape, so it can travel a lot further than mustards or other plants like that.
We do have a question from Marjorie. It looks like her hand is up. And then
Okay.
anybody else has a questions, maybe let's pause and have a question time.
Sure.
This is Candy. What is
The deer bring the,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
go ahead, Candy.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
Okay. We have the prickly lettuce on it. Thank God we do, you know. And the deer bring the prickly lettuce, it seems, on their, and the thistle. And when they settle down in a certain area, they seem to spread it in those areas. So I don't know. I just try to pull it up. The other thing I just wanted to contribute was we just got back from a trip to Los Angeles. So it was a long ride. there is so much of that Russian thistle in the desert. It's all along the roadsides in northern Arizona. Unbelievable. Even in the Mojave Desert, going through California. And I was wondering, what the heck is that? I knew it was tumbleweed. It's all over in the disturbed areas. So it's not just a problem for us, I guess.
Yeah, it's the whole West. And yeah, I think a lot of it has to do with overgrazing for centuries. And then, yeah, just drier climate and stuff like that. And once something starts getting established, it's really hard to get rid of. And then you're right, animals definitely do spread those seeds. Livestock, even people can spread those seeds as well, birds. So even if it's not on your property, it can still come from other places.
Benjamin, as far as cheatgrass goes, what does it look like in its infant form?
Well, it
It
looks
looks-
like nice tender grass, and it's kind of pubescent, so it kind of has some hairy follicles. But the main thing is that twist. So it has this spiral shape to that grass blade, and that's really the main way you can identify it.
Okay.
And it's an annual, so it's typically not going to have like a deep root system or anything. And then also just looking at the historical areas where you've seen cheatgrass in the past. So sometimes you can actually see those skeletons still there with the new growth coming up in the fall. And
Okay.
so, yeah, and that one's just tricky because it blooms before you know it, and then it's already seeded out by May, and a lot of other plants haven't even started yet. And so there is maybe some hope for some biological control. There's supposedly some bacteria that might work on it, but it's not been approved yet. And there is a herbicide that is actually a pre-emergent that can control annual weeds like cheatgrass for up to 3 years. But it's fairly expensive, but it's kind of promising, because otherwise you're kind of looking at either Roundup or using other selective herbicides at a higher rate, and a lot of times you damage your grasses,
Mhm.
even though they were broadleaf.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And then jointed goat, great. Let's see.
So I had one more question, kind of related. Is there an app that can help us identify noxious weeds or bad bugs?
I'm not sure about the bugs. I personally just use Google Lens for identifying plants, and it can be kind of 50-50, but if you have a good clean picture of something and it's a fairly common weed, it usually does pretty well. And so that's a place to start. And then there's Weeds of the West, which used to be kind of the weeds Bible. They don't print it anymore, but we have a link on our website, and that can be a good resource as well.
Thank you.
Jointed goatgrass is another winter annual, not super common, especially around gardens, but its characteristic traits are these segmented seed segments that kind of break apart, and it's not good for wildlife or grazing animals. But it starts in the kind of fallish time and then pretty much seeds out by spring. So that leaves us with the biennials and perennials. Biennials are basically a 2-year life cycle plant. The first year it's a rosette, so low to the ground, don't really notice it. And then the second year it bolts, goes to flower, and then it seeds out. There are some cases where it'll become an annual, but typically it's 2 years, which is kind of nice because it gives you a little more time to deal with those plants. A lot of those annuals also bloom earlier than the biennials. But our most common one is musk thistle. One plant can produce 20,000 seeds. It's highly competitive, invades many types of landscapes, outcompetes other native plants in general, kind of takes over areas that have been disturbed in general. One thing that people tend to kind of freak out about is after it's seeded, it dries out and you see these cotton flights blowing around, and looks like those flights are blowing miles away, and people get hysterical, and they think that they're just getting inundated with those seeds. But typically less than 5% of the seed remains attached, and it breaks off during that flowering process. And another way to look at it is if that seed is still attached to that cotton flight, it has enough weight to bring it down. So that cotton flight kind of acts as a parachute, but the seed itself weighs it down. So it typically won't move more than like 20 or 30 feet away, depending on the wind. So this is what a kind of a classic musk rosette looks like. You can see that white coloration on the outlines of the leaves. And sometimes it's a kind of a reddish color. These leaflets are more or less symmetrical and really kind of evenly spaced out. The plant surface is kind of waxy, kind of a dark green color. And then typically this lays flat on the ground at a 90-degree angle. And you'll just see a few of them here and there. And this is what happens when you have an established musk thistle population. This was a roadside that was plowed or kind of made for a subdivision that never really happened. And you can just tell that there's millions of seeds just from this crop. But in general, the seed bank is just so vast. And once it gets established, it's really hard to get rid of. And then a lot of people have a hard time identifying musk thistle. Most people just call any kind of thistle Canada thistle. The best way is to either look at the rosette or to look at the flower head. And so these flower heads are typically the size of like a silver dollar. They're almost kind of flat in shape. You have these really spiky bracts that kind of make up 50% of the flower, and then the petals kind of come up, typically kind of a dark purple color. And then another common biennial thistle that we have is Scotch thistle. And you can see right away, it looks a lot different. It's got a lighter green color, almost like a grayish color. It's got like some hairy follicles on the leaves too. The leaves are a lot more robust, a lot wider. And it's just kind of a bigger plant in general. And it just kind of creates these big bunches, and it can grow up to 7 feet tall. They almost look like Christmas trees. And so with these biennials, it's best to stop them before they get bigger and bigger, because the bigger the plant is, the harder it is to deal with in general. And then this is what the flower looks like. And so you can see it's got that roundish kind of bulbous shape, and then kind of closes and then it reopens again. And so that's characteristic of Scotch thistle. There are some native thistles that kind of have a flower that's similar. The first two here are the New Mexican thistle, but you can see the bottom here, the leaves are not nearly as robust. The leaflets are a lot more serrated and just kind of symmetrical. And you'll just see a couple of these thistles. You won't see like huge populations of them. You just see a few of them here and there. And then the one on the right here, that is plat thistle, and that puts out a white flower. And so native thistles are fine. They just really don't take over like the non-natives. And then hound's tongue, this is another common one, especially in wild areas or areas with wildlife. 2 pounds of this can kill a full-size cow. So in areas that are heavily grazed, you'll see a lot of this hound's tongue because cows kind of know not to eat it. And then this is what it looks like as a rosette. And then it puts out purple flowers, and then it puts out these Velcro-like seeds. They're pretty small, but they'll attach to anything, like socks, fur, stuff like that. And so it really gets around. And here's a picture of kind of the preferred shovel that I would recommend for digging up annuals or biennials, especially biennials. Annuals have kind of a smaller, thinner root system, whereas biennials kind of have a thick taproot. And so some people try to just mow biennials or annuals. The thing is, it still grows back because it can grow back from that root system. And so you have to keep up with the mowing. But if you really want to get rid of it, and not create a big disturbance, we recommend using one of these narrow kind of spade-like shovels, go in at a 45-degree angle, and just go in and then go back out and then pull the plant up. Some people use a big old shovel. You have these big holes and you end up creating a lot of surface, almost like what prairie dogs would create. You kind of make it more susceptible to weeds in the future. And then at this stage, since this is flowering, you can dig it up and put it on the ground and think that it's dead, but there's enough nutrients in that plant where it'll actually still continue its seed production and actually still seed out, even if it's severed from the ground. So if you have plants that have already flowered and there's quite a bit of plant material with it, you're best off just bagging it and disposing that before they go to seed. Poison hemlock is the most poisonous plant in North America. It's also a biennial. We have two types of hemlock. Poison hemlock is non-native, but we have Western water hemlock, which is native. Main difference is poison hemlock have these kind of purplish splotches along the stem, whereas Western water hemlock does not, but they're both extremely poisonous. You typically only see these in riparian areas, so wetlands, canals, stuff like that. We don't really recommend hand pulling them, or if you are, use some gloves that you can throw away at the end of it. But it's just something to look out for. There are some other plants that look similar. There's Queen's Anne's lace, but it will grow pretty much anywhere, whereas this this hemlock only grows in these wet areas. And then some people kind of confuse it with Osha, which is a high country plant. Typically, you only see it above 9,000 feet. But what's characteristic of it is it has these hollow stems and hollow branches. And it's just something you got to really watch out for. Mainly an issue for grazing animals. We've seen a lot of fatalities with grazing animals because they'll nibble a little bit of poison hemlock, next to some grass, or some people will actually bale some of these poisonous plants in with hay. And then perennials. There's two different types of perennials. There's short-lived and long-lived perennials. The short-lived have root systems that aren't nearly as deep as the long-lived. And so example of that is oxeye daisy, spotted knapweed. And so they'll typically grow from the same root system, 3 to 5 times, or 3 to 5 years. So oxeye daisy, it grows anywhere from 5,000 feet to 12,000 feet, reproduces by seed and underground rhizomes. So a lot of times these perennials are connected underground by those horizontal root systems. It produces 500 seeds each plant. Isn't really used by pollinators like bees or butterflies, although I have seen flies use it. Ultimately, it reduces native wildflower diversity and it reduces or eliminates forage for wildlife and grazing animals. So this is kind of what it looks like. There are native daisies, so you shouldn't confuse that with oxeye daisy. Oxeye daisy has flowers that are about the size of a quarter, and they have rounded petals and like a little kind of concave disc shape in the middle of the flower itself. A lot of the native daisies are also called fleabane, and the leaves are actually smaller. The flower is about the size of a dime, and the petals have square edges on the actual petals itself. And there's also Shasta daisy, which is kind of a robust ornamental. It's typically bigger and the leaves look a lot different. The leaves are more broadleaf and it's just bigger in general. And so this is what a monoculture of oxeye daisy looks like. And the sad thing is what we've discovered after studying it for quite a few years is that it has multiple flushes throughout the season. And so different plants flower at different times of the year. And so what we see here is just one flush. And ultimately, there's still a lot of rosettes underneath this canopy that you can't even see that just aren't flowering yet. So it makes it really difficult to control. If you have just a few of them, you can sometimes get away with mechanically removing them. But typically the root ball is pretty big. And so that surface disturbance can kind of be a big impact to the ground itself. And we actually have a cooperative weed management area for the San Juan Mountains. And the primary issue with the weeds is oxeye daisy, yellow toadflax, and Canada thistle, but by far it's oxeye daisy. So you can kind of see the difference of kind of more natural landscape with biodiversity versus a monoculture. And so we were trying to work with San Juan County and Silverton to try to eliminate some of these oxeye daisy populations that are slowly creeping into kind of these nicer, pristine wildflower areas. And so just in general, the more diversity that a landscape has, the healthier it is. And so that ecosystem is just more healthy in general when you have a dense kind of population of different types of plants, because they all have their different roles and they bring different nutrients into the soil and stuff. And so that biodiversity is really important in general. And so you can see the difference when you have biodiversity versus a monoculture. Spotted knapweed, it can produce up to 2,500 seeds each season, and it has a really high germination rate of 90%. The seeds can stay viable for up to 8 years, increases in area up to 25% annually. It can grow anywhere from dry riverbeds to roadsides to range to mountains. It's very drought tolerant, and it typically grows 3 to 5 years from the same plant. And so you can really define it best when it's flowering. It has these dark bracts, so that's where it gets the name spotted. And so you got these dark bracts, then it closes and then reopens again. The leaves in general are a little more kind of like a grayish light green color. And once you kind of recognize those leaves, you can target it earlier before it flowers, or you can just look at the past year's skeleton. So most plants will have a skeleton at its base from previous years. And so that's another way to identify it. And you can see it's just coming back from that same root system year after year. And it's growing out of, rock with very minimal soil. Canada thistle. This is maybe the hardest perennial to deal with. And even back in 1975, it was considered the most problematic weed in the US and one of the worst ones globally. There's a study that estimated that there's a $320 million annual loss to prairie producers, and reduced up to 60% of the crop yield. It's a deep-rooted perennial. So what you see above the surface is typically 15%, maybe 25% of the plant mass, where the rest of it is underground. So what you see is just the tip of the iceberg. It can grow 15 feet deep, and then each plant above ground is connected underground. It produces a lot of seeds, has a relatively low viability rate, but if it's producing thousands of seeds, there's still going to be some viable seeds in there. Those seeds can last up to 20 years if they're buried deep enough. We never recommend plowing, disking, or tilling, because it makes it worse, makes it actually more dense. And so here's a cross section of Canada thistle, and it really shows those rhizomatous root systems that are all kind of connected underground. And if you have something that's established enough, it's just a spider web of roots. And so what you're really thinking about is that root system rather than just what's on the top of the surface. this is what it looks like as a rosette form. It's different than the biennials. The leaves aren't really symmetrical, kind of a lighter green. The leaves typically come up at a 45-degree angle, and you'll typically see quite a few little plants together. So you'll see a lot of these in the same area. And so that's more typical of a perennial that is all coming from the same root system. But if you just have a couple of these small little plants, it is possible to hand pull it and just to keep up with it before it gets established. But once it is established, it's really, really difficult to control, especially organically. And then it flowers later in the year than most of the thistles, the biennials. Typically like musk thistle, Scotch thistle, they bloom late June, July, whereas Canada thistle blooms late July, August. And these are what the flowers look like. And they almost kind of look like a knapweed, but the leaves are totally different. It's clearly a thistle. But these little flowers are about the size of a pinky, so they're fairly small. So definitely don't disc it. Tilling stimulates new growth, and each little root segment can turn into a new plant. Ken Beck with CSU, he said you can mechanically control it if you keep up with it every 2 weeks for up to 5 years. And so that's not very practical for pretty much anybody. You end up just really tearing up the soil in the process. It's really, really tough. And then some people try to use vinegar for some of these weeds, and vinegar can work on annuals and biennial if you get enough on the plant, but it's just a contact burn, so it's never going to systemically get into the root system or anything. It's just going to burn that part of the plant that it's in contact with. And so you can dig it, you can mow it, you can burn it, but the bulk of the plant mass is underground. There is a host-specific pathogenic rust fungus that has some kind of promising results in some parts of the state. That said, I've been trying to get it established in different parts of Durango for 5 years, and I haven't had any luck with it. However, in the North Animas Valley, they've had some luck getting it reestablished or having it reproduce on its own. But it's maybe 1 out of 50 plants. And so all biocontrol is a really long-term process. If you just have a small little garden, biocontrol really isn't the best method because it just takes so long. Biocontrol is best in areas that are maybe in some sensitive areas like some wetlands or organic large-scale farms, something like that. And it's not a guarantee, and it's just kind of a long-term solution in general. But we're trying to get it established, and then hopefully if we can get enough of it, we can give it out to different people throughout the county. Russian knapweed is another really tough perennial. It can grow even deeper than Canada thistle, 20 feet deep. It can actually keep growing under the frost line. It produces an allelopathic chemical that kills off other plants. Over time, if a horse eats enough of it, it can kill the horse. It's extremely hard to control. We have been releasing a couple bugs on it throughout the kind of southwest area, and we do have them established, but we're talking about thousands and thousands of acres of this, and so it's kind of a long-term solution. And a lot of places in the southwest part of the county that used to have crops, just they didn't have enough moisture for the last 20, 30 years. They left those fields to go fallow, and then it's just the Russian knapweed that takes over. And just to demonstrate how tough this stuff is, here's Russian knapweed growing out of asphalt. And it's not just growing out of it, it's thriving. And so it's a real tough plant. And typically it kind of has that lighter greenish color. It will bloom earlier than spotted knapweed. Typically you'll see blooms in June. And a lot of times you'll you won't necessarily see that pink. You'll just see a lot of the white on those buds of the plant itself. But yeah, all these plants are connected underground. Don't recommend hand pulling it because it's not effective, but people have actually gotten some kind of dermal toxic reaction to their hands and stuff like that. So it's really nasty. And these are what the flowers look like. So kind of similar to Canada thistle, but you can see these leaves are not thistle. They're very narrow and stuff like that. Yellow toadflax is another perennial. It's not nearly as deep rooted as those other two, but it can really take over. If you just have a few of them, you can sometimes get away with just hand pulling it. But typically when you hand pull it, you'll see a little horizontal root system that you broke off. And so it's still alive underground. The flowers typically look like a snapdragon. The flowers kind of look nice. But the best way to identify this one, even before it's flowering, is to pull it up. And if you see kind of a purplish color right next to the soil, that's the yellow toadflax. And it typically blooms later in the year, like around August as well. Leafy spurge, this is only a problem in really specific areas of the county, but it can be extremely hard to get rid of. It produces a toxic sap too. This one's just really hard to take care of once it's established. White top is a mustard that's a real early bloomer. So you typically see it blooming in May. And so it does have a deep root system. And so treatment has to be kind of more centered towards using a systemic herbicide at the right time. And there are some other plants that look similar to it, but you can see these leaves are pretty big. And then it kind of turns like a yellow color afterwards. There is a native called yarrow that's really common. If you crush up the leaf, it smells like mint. And there's some stuff like pennycress that looks similar, but typically this stuff will bloom well ahead of all those other plants. Field bindweed, that's another major perennial. It's not as much of a issue with grazing producers because it does have nutritional value for grazing animals. But if it's in the garden, it can really be hard to take care of. So it's a deep-rooted perennial. The leaves are distinguishable by their arrowhead shape. And so the leaves and the flowers are really small, but you can kind of see these lobes, kind of looks like a little arrowhead, and the flowers are really small, kind of have a pinkish color to it. Unfortunately, the seeds can stay valuable from anywhere from 40 to I've seen 70 years. So that's kind of depressing. And there is a mite that works on this, but I think it's another kind of long-term solution. And so it's just kind of tough to deal with in general. So do we have any questions at this point?
If you, like in the rosette form of a weed, will the tap still be pretty deep on that? Or is, like if you wanted to just dig it out?
It's not nearly as big as a rosette as it is when it starts getting bigger. So the bigger it gets above ground, kind of the bigger that taproot gets. Mm-hmm. In some cases, you'll get thistles that are 3 or 4 feet tall, and you can't even hit it with a shovel because it's so thick. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, trying to identify it early on is ideal.
Okay. Thank you.
And then somebody said something about spotted knapweed looking a little bit like Scottish thistle. Not really. Like the leaves are so much different. Scotch thistle has big, wide leaves. It has spikes on it. It's pubescent, so it has hairy follicles. The flower head is a bit more robust, kind of the size of like a quarter, whereas spotted knapweed is real small, smaller than like a dime even. And then the leaves aren't thorny at all. But like trying to find those skeletons is kind of the best way to find them, or just to just get familiar with the leaf shape. we'll kind of go into methods of control. And, you know, in some cases, a lot of these annuals, biennials, before they get out of hand, you can mow them or hand pull them. You know, that mowing is tough because it'll still grow out of that same root system. But it is possible, especially have small populations of it. And then if you have more widespread issues with weeds, you know, typically large acreage, herbicides are more effective in the long run, or I mean, the short term, and therefore the long run. And they're broken up into 3 different types. So there's broadly specific herbicides that are non-systemic. So that means it only interacts with certain broadleaf plants, and it doesn't get translocated into the root system. So an example of that is 2,4-D. It's one of the more common non-systemic herbicides that are broadleaf. It's fairly affordable. You see results pretty quick, but that can be kind of deceiving. Some people will spray Canada thistle with 2,4-D and they'll see the leaves and the plant yellow and curl. But like I said, that's only about 15% of the plant mass. The rest of it's underground. And then there's broadleaf specific herbicides that are more systemic. So that means it'll translocate into the root system. And that's what you need with these deep-rooted perennials. And a lot of people think that all herbicides are just universal toxic liquids that kill everything. But all of these herbicides, you know, all these broadly specific herbicides only work with certain populations of different plants. So for example, milestone won't kill houndstone, it won't kill white top, it won't kill leafy spurge. So a lot of the active ingredients in these herbicides only work with certain types of plants. They interact in a special way with that metabolism of the plant. So it's not this universal poison like some people portray. There is a difference between herbicides and insecticides. They're both considered pesticides, but insecticides are kind of a different story, and they can kind of have other issues in general. But in general, we recommend broadly specific herbicides because it's going to keep your grasses intact. And so you can spray an area like a hayfield or something, and you can target those broadleaf weeds and they'll keep your competitive grasses alive. Whereas a non-selective but also systemic herbicide is glyphosate, also known as Roundup. And there's definitely a lot of controversy about glyphosate, and I think for some good reasons overall. I think the main concern is the use of glyphosate on widespread crops and the industrial use of it. They've genetically engineered crops to survive glyphosate treatments, but it kills all the plants underneath. So that's a totally different story than what we're talking about. We're just talking about using glyphosate in a controlled manner. It actually has a low toxicity overall, but I don't recommend eating it or putting it in your body in any way, shape, or form. But it can be useful in areas where you want to reseed, because it'll actually break down within 2 weeks and become inert. And so if you don't have time to let these systemic herbicides kind of do their thing for 6 months or so, that glyphosate can be handy, especially with these deep-rooted perennials, because it is systemic. And you can be really selective with it. You can put it like on a paintbrush or put it on like a wet cloth or something like that, and just put it on the plants itself. And then we always recommend using a surfactant or crop oil if you're going to apply herbicides. So surfactants, you typically want a non-ionic surfactant. So dish soap doesn't really work very well. Those non-ionic surfactants work best in the spring and fall. When it's hot and dry, like it typically is, in the summer, we recommend a crop oil or a mentholated seed oil. And that just helps break up the water surface tension when you spray it on a plant, and also helps penetrate that plant surface. A lot of times in the summer, the plant is more resistant to outside substances, and it just has hairy follicles that will keep that droplet from actually penetrating the leaf surface. So it keeps it, breaks up that water surface tension, so it kind of spreads out more and just gets into the plant better in general. One thing to be aware of with these systemic herbicides that are more residual, like milestone, dicamba, stuff like that. If an ag producer sprays their field and the cows graze that field, that manure can contain the active ingredient in these systemic herbicides. So you got to be really careful about where you get your manure. It's best to know the history of it, and if there's any chance that it's been used with herbicide, or if there's any chance that, you know, the hay that those cows or horses or whatever were eating, I wouldn't recommend using that that manure. If you're unsure, you can do it like a little test with the bioassay. Try to plant a couple of crops that you're planning on growing, and, you know, put that manure in there and just see if it works or not. And then also just looking at integrated weed management techniques. And so it's not just mechanical, it's not just chemical, trying to prevent weeds from becoming an issue in the first place, and minimizing that disturbance, minimizing dirt work or plowing, grazing, stuff like that. Mechanical methods can work if you keep those annuals and biennials mowed before they go to seed. And so I don't really like recommending mowing every week, because a lot of times what happens is the competitive plants and the grasses and stuff like that, they get stressed out so much that they never get enough time to grow tall. And so the longer time grasses have to grow tall, the more deep that root system is going to get. And so if you're constantly mowing something, you're kind of hurting your competitive plants as well. So that's just something to consider. And then in some cases, if biological control seems like the best method, you can use that. And there's chemical as well, which is more common along like right-of-ways, road right-of-ways, and larger acreage. In revegetation, just having some kind of competitive competition, or even putting weed barrier, just something that blocks those plants from filling in all those blank spots that you'll see in gardens, and just trying to have dense rows where you just don't have a lot of bare spots in between. Just trying to eliminate those bare spots as best you can will help you out in the long run. And then with some of these weeds that are more established, you really got to commit, 3 to 5 years and just keep up with it every year. Some plants are easier to get rid of than others, but in general, you just got to keep up with it. And then here's some resources and some links. I'll actually bring up our website because it has a lot of this information, but just in general, the Palisade insectary, they're the ones that we use for biological control. They typically charge for their releases, and every year is a little bit different. The NRCS has a lot of good programs for kind of large scale producers, especially with irrigation and stuff like that. We like Southwest Seed Company. They're out of Dolores. They have really good customized seed mixes and stuff like that. They can actually take a look at what your soil is and your terrain and elevation, stuff like that, and recommend more specific type seed mixes. You can buy that at Durango Nursery. And with the plant IDs, if you're going to bring in a sample, more mature it is, the easier it is to identify, and just keep those roots kind of wetted, and maybe try app first. And then I'll go to our website here. Okay, laplataweeds.org. And then on this left-hand column, we have a lot of different links that will go over education resources, enforceable weeds. So those are the A and B listed weeds, native poisonous plants. There's actually a lot of native poisonous plants out there. We don't consider them noxious weeds because they are native. The weed list, weed law, stuff like that. If you click on this education resources link, you can access that Weeds of the West book. You can see the Colorado Department of Ag's current noxious weed list. There's turf weed ID sites. There's a guide to poisonous plants that's really good. And then the Southwest Wildflower website is great. It has pretty much all of the native plants in our area. and some of the non-native plants. And so that's another good thing. Information about herbicide. We also have information about organic weed management and links to that. And then if you're worried about carryover with herbicides, we have quite a few links. We have a in-depth way of testing your manure for herbicides and stuff like that. So that's about what I have. Does anybody have any questions?
That's awesome. Thank you, Ben. Does anybody have any questions for him?
Well, yes, Ben, it's Marjorie. I was wondering, sometimes I'll just go out and cut off the seed heads, cut about halfway down and just put them in a plastic bag, rather than trying to pull some of the weeds. And then I found that worked with mullein. Just cut off the tops and we never had it come back. So
Especially mullein.
how does that sound?
Well, it depends on the plant. Mullein makes a lot of sense because you just have a singular stalk and all the flowers pretty much start at a certain point and rise up. And so you just have one stalk, whereas like musk thistle or a lot of these other plants, they'll have multiple branches with seed heads all over the place. So for those type of plants, it's just a lot of work. And if you're going to go through that effort, you might as well just dig it up and keep it from, because you can still cut off the flowers and it'll still keep flowering. And so you want to just stop that seeding process first and foremost. And then if you do have those flowered parts that are actually going to seed, then you just need to contain them before they hit the ground.
Yeah, I put them in a plastic bag. And then take that to the, I guess it goes in the waste in Colorado. I don't know. Not so good anyway.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, I know it kind of seems silly, but it's better than like putting it in a corner or something, because you're always going to have those seeds in that area. Some people are really fired up about burning stuff, and typically we don't recommend that for a lot of different reasons. But if the fire isn't hot enough, it actually won't kill the seed itself. So some people try to burn a field and they think, oh, I'll just kill all the seeds. In some cases, that actually scarifies the seed, so it's actually more prone to germination. And then we've seen it with cheatgrass, where you have this real thin kind of stem, and that thin stem burns quicker than the seeds itself. So what happens is it just makes those seeds drop. And then if you're going to burn it hot enough to kill the seeds, you're typically going to kill soil microbes as well. So, maybe if you have a burn barrel, that's probably the best way. If you have a burn pile, what we've seen is you just kill kind of the soil conditions there, and you'll just kind of constantly have weeds in that area. It's kind of a dead spot, but you just have a lot of weeds coming up. So that's just something to consider.
We haven't been able to burn at all here in Colorado, at least. I would have loved to burn some things, but no, that's not. I guess you can still burn in a barrel, but we haven't been able to burn at all, the way I understand it, for years.
Well, it depends. They're actually doing some controlled burning around Edgemont right now. But, this is winter, there's a lot of moisture, stuff like that. But pretty much from April to November, even December may not be a good idea. Oh, and I just wanted to touch on seeding. Seeds typically need water, so that can make it real tough if you're dryland farming or you have range that doesn't have water. Typically, the times that we recommend seeding with dry land is in the fall, like late fall, because you don't want to plant it in September, October. It germinates, then freezes and dies. You want to do it after everything's been freezing. So typically around Thanksgiving, Historically, that's kind of been when we get some snow that kind of sticks around for a while. The idea being that you put out that grass seed, and then it's always important to get good soil seed contact. If you just have seeds on the top surface, a lot of that stuff won't germinate. And if it does, it's so shallow rooted that it's going to get nuked by the wind or the sun or something like that. So just trying to scratch it into the surface about 1/2 inch if possible. Or if you can do it right before a big snowstorm in the fall, hopefully that snow will cover that grass seed and kind of drive it down a little bit. If we don't have a good late fall, you can do it in the springtime. Just any time when the soil surface is going to be wet for probably 2 to 3 weeks. Typically, like late spring, like May and June are terrible times to plant seeds because those are typically are driest and sometimes hottest points of the growing season. If we have a really good monsoon season, it looks like we got more rain in the forecast, you can do it then. But you need at least a week or 2 of moisture, because a lot of times you can put that seed out, it starts to germinate, and then a week later it's 95 degrees and those plants don't have any moisture and they die. So that's just something to think about for reseeding for dry land.
Thank you, Ben. I appreciate it big time. And like I said, this will be, I'll stop the recording here in a second. And then if you guys need to go back and catch something you may have missed, I'll have a link to you guys sent hopefully within the next day or so.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
Hi, Darren. I had a question for you.
Sure, Kathy.
I had a weed day today, and so I listened to Tony Koski this morning instead of whatever we did with you all. Sorry about that. And so I wondered if you would be also sending out the link for this morning's session.
Yep, I'm currently converting that to an MP4 that will be on YouTube. So hopefully that will be out at the same time this will be. In the
Great.
next 24 hours.
And just to let Ben know, since I did do both today, I would just like to say you did a fabulous job. Thank you so much.
Oh,
Thank you.
comparable to Dr. Koski. That's quite
Well, yeah. I mean, a lot of you guys don't probably have some of these weeds, and for gardening, it's kind of a different story. But typically, you'll see more of those annuals. But yeah, we're here to help. And yeah, if somebody wants a site consultation, we typically start doing that kind of mid-May and after.
So I have a question. I don't know if you covered the connection, but Katrina Blair at the Turtle Lake, did you talk about eating weeds?
Oh,